Hi guys, just a little April showers bring April flowers. So I thought maybe you'd like to see a little glimpse of spring before we go into chapter 7. So again, as I mentioned in the email that I sent out to you a little while ago, chapter 7 isn't a lot of really new stuff that you really, have a good handle on already. It just talks about it in a little more detail. You can think of it as, maybe the calm before the storm of chapter 8, which there's, a lot more information, novel information in chapter 8. But chapter 7 deals with single factor designs. Basically, what we've been dealing with, mostly up to this point, single factor designs, essentially one independent variable. But now, instead of just dealing with two levels like we talked about in the previous chapter, now we're going to talk about one independent variable with more than two levels. Okay, so in this particular case, again, in any of these situations, they can be between subjects, within subjects. But the other thing that's mentioned in this chapter is what's known as ex post facto designs. All that means is that you're using a subject or participant characteristic variable rather than a true independent variable. And we talked about these a little bit earlier in the semester. Things like gender, something where you cannot randomly assign people into those groups. They are basically self-selecting into those groups. Gender, class standing, your race, okay, age, any of those things are basically, again, participant characteristic variables. And so if you use that as if it's an independent variable, okay, you can use these one factor designs. All right, so again, if we just have two levels of the independent variable, the statistic that you would run would be a t-test, and again, would just be dependent on whether it's between subjects or within subjects design. If it's a subject characteristic variable participant, you would use a between subjects t-test. Okay, if it was just, male versus female, do you want to see if there's a difference between males and females on, spatial ability, for example, or linguistic ability, word recall, anything along those lines. Okay, so those are the that's again, if you just have two levels of the independent variable. Right. So how about why would you want to expand it to more than two levels? Okay, there's a couple of great examples of that in the text. The first one is basically what's known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. You may have heard of this, in terms of, performance in general. Maybe if you have any background in sports psych. The idea here is that there's a relationship between your arousal level and performance. So, what if your arousal level is too low? Then you're sort of bored, right? So your performance isn't going to be that good. So if your arousal level is higher, your performance is going to increase. So if you only use two levels of the independent variable, low arousal level and moderate arousal level, and you did that as a between subjects experiment, then measured your performance in some sort of way, you would basically have the hypothesis that higher arousal increases performance. And if you only use low and moderate, that's exactly what you would find. Okay, but what if you used a low level of arousal and then a very high level of arousal, actually to the point where you would start feeling anxious? If you only use those two levels, okay, you would find that there would be no difference. It would be low performance for the low arousal level, low performance for the high arousal level. So in that particular case, you would not see any difference. So what you would have to do is to find out this actual shape, this inverted U shape, as it's called, of the Yerkes-Dodson law, is you would need at least three levels. One low level, one moderate level, and then one very high level. And then you would get this inverted U-shaped curve. So then you would actually get a better sense of what the relationship is between arousal level and performance. Okay. Another example of why you would want to use more than two levels would be any sort of drug study where you would have dosage levels. You want to make sure that your drug works, but what dosage would be the best to decrease the symptoms of whatever drug that whatever symptom that you're trying to deal with, without having the dosage level too high where there might be side effects. So you want to check to see what would be the proper dosage level. So again, you wouldn't want to just use 0 and then 10 milligrams, for example. You may want to use 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 milligrams to see which dosage is most effective without having too high of a dosage. Right. And the other thing that we can talk about in terms of more than 2 levels is any, speaking of drug studies, any sort of control group. Okay, so if you have a control group and a placebo group, and then any level of your drug, all of a sudden you've got 3 levels already. So again, now you have more than 2 levels of the independent variable. And again, in most drug studies or alcohol studies like that, you would almost immediately have at least 3 levels, and then any sort of gradations of the dosage or the amount of the independent variable at that point. Okay, not too surprisingly, I hope at this point, since you all took Psy290, what statistic would you use in this particular case? Analysis of variance, right? Okay, one independent variable or a one-way analysis of variance you would use, and then you would, if you did get an effect, what you then do is use a post hoc test to see where the difference between each of those 3 levels would actually be. Okay. Just like before, you can have between subjects, within subjects, or ex post facto. The analysis variance would change. Again, if it was a between subjects, you would use a one-way between subjects analysis of variance. If it was repeated measures, you would use a one-way repeated measures analysis of variance. And again, if it's ex post facto, you would use a between subjects analysis of variance. But again, you would have to be a little bit cautious in terms of how you would actually interpret that, since you're not randomly assigning people into those groups. Okay, all right. So a couple of the other issues that are mentioned in this chapter, as I showed you in the PowerPoints, the idea of inter-rater reliability. What you want to do is, if you are doing any sort of study where you have different observers observing something like, the aggression level of children in a schoolyard or something, what you'd want to do is make sure that you have more than one person, monitoring that dependent variable. Because there can be differences between the different observers, okay, the different people rating these behaviors. So you want to make sure they have at least probably 3, if not 4, independent raters, and hopefully you correlate their ratings, and hopefully everybody pretty much comes up with the same number of acts in terms of the dependent variable. Okay. The other thing that's mentioned in this chapter that we haven't really talked about before a little bit when we talked about means is outliers. What you want to do is make sure that if you do have any outliers, that can skew the mean, which also can affect your outcome of your statistics. If you're really afraid of outliers, what you really need to do is have some sort of a priori criterion to exclude people that fall way outside of the range that you would expect. For example, if we did a word list with 20 items again, what if somebody scored 0? Okay, well, something's definitely not right there. Either that person was asleep, or they weren't paying attention, or they were trying to screw up your experiment. Okay, so if you have some a priori reason for excluding an outlier, then you can do that. You can't go willy-nilly, though. You can't do it after the fact and say, oh, this person has 0, I'm just going to throw them out. That's getting a little iffy in terms of, more than a little iffy in terms of the ethics here. Okay? All right, so that's our first go-around for Chapter 7. Second part I'll do in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. So hope everybody's good. Hope everybody's having, good time, at least, hopefully, or at least not going too crazy. And I'll talk to you guys in a little while. Okay, stay safe. Take care. Bye.